Deep in the emerald twilight of the Pacific jungle, silence was a lie. The air didn't just hang, it pressed against you, heavy with moisture and the rot of a million decaying leaves. To a soldier on the ground, the war here wasn't just against an enemy army, it was a war against the earth itself. Vines as thick as a man's arm choked the trails. Mud, deep and sucking, threatened to pull boots right off feet. Mountains rose up like jagged teeth, covered in slippery moss and hidden beneath a canopy so dense that the sun was nothing more than a rumor. For the Japanese commanders dug into these remote ridges, this terrain was their greatest ally. They looked at the maps, at the impossible contour lines, at the rivers that turned into raging torrents with every afternoon rain, and they felt a sense of absolute security. They knew the rules of war. They knew that armies moved on their stomachs, but more importantly, they moved on wheels and tracks. Tanks needed solid ground. Supply trucks needed roads. And artillery, the god of war, needed to be dragged, pushed, or towed. In their minds, the Americans were shackled to their machines. They believed that if you went deep enough into the green hell, far enough away from the beaches and the landing craft, you were safe from the heavy metal rain of American firepower. A rifleman might hike up a goat trail, sure. A mortar team might scramble up a muddy slope. But a cannon, a field gun capable of shattering a bunker from miles away, physics said no. Geography said no. And so the Japanese High Command rested their defense on a simple, undeniable fact: the jungle was a wall that modern technology could not breach. They were wrong. They were looking at the ground, measuring the mud and the slopes, calculating the logistics of mules and men. They forgot to look up. They didn't realize that the rules of warfare were being rewritten in secret testing grounds thousands of miles away. They couldn't imagine that the Americans were about to do something that defied military logic. They were about to take the heavy, iron-barreled brutality of artillery and turn it into something that could float on the wind. To understand the sheer shock of what was coming, you have to understand the nightmare of the logistics in the Pacific theater in the early 1940s. This wasn't Europe. In Europe there were roads, there were rail lines. There were maps that had been accurate for 100 years. When you invaded France or pushed into Germany, you could plan a convoy. You could say, move battery A to point B, and there was a reasonable expectation that a truck could drive there. In the Pacific, a road was often just a line on a map that turned out to be a swamp. A 10-mile advance could take a week, and every step of the way, you had to carry everything you needed to kill the enemy and keep yourself alive. Water, ammunition, food, medicine. Every pound counted. A soldier carrying a rifle and a pack was already pushing the limits of human endurance in that heat. The idea of dragging a standard artillery piece which could weigh thousands of pounds through a triple canopy jungle was laughable. The Japanese knew this. Their entire defensive strategy in places like New Guinea and the Philippines often relied on impassable terrain. They would fortify the high ground, deep in the interior, reachable only by narrow, winding footpaths. They would dig deep tunnel networks reinforced with palm logs and dirt, effectively disappearing into the landscape. From these nests, they could rain mortar fire and machine gun bullets down on approaching American troops, who were struggling just to stay upright in the mud. When American infantry tried to assault these positions, they often found themselves outgunned. They had their rifles, grenades, and maybe a 60mm mortar if they were lucky. But against a fortified pillbox made of logs and earth, a rifle bullet is useless. You need high explosives. You need the ability to reach out and smash a defensive position from a distance. You need artillery. But the artillery was miles back, stuck on the beach or bogged down on a muddy track, unable to get into range. The result was a bloody stalemate. American patrols would push forward, get pinned down by heavy fire from a hidden bunker, and have no way to knock it out. They would have to withdraw, call for air support, which was often impossible due to the thick tree cover obscuring the target, or try a suicidal frontal assault. The casualty rates climbed. The frustration mounted. The jungle was winning. But back in the United States, and in the rear echelon bases of Australia, a different kind of thinking was taking shape. The American military machine was vast, industrial, and often slow, but it had a unique capacity for problem solving. Engineers and strategists looked at the problem of the jungle and realized they needed a weapon that broke the rules of weight and transport. They needed a gun that punched like a heavyweight but traveled like a featherweight. Enter the M1 75mm Pack Howitzer. This wasn't a new idea, strictly speaking. Mountain guns had existed for a long time, small cannons designed to be taken apart and carried by mules up steep trails. But the Americans took this concept and adapted it for a new age. They refined a weapon that could be broken down into 9 separate loads. The tube, the breech, the trails, the wheels, the sleigh, every part could be disconnected. The genius wasn't just that it came apart, it was how it came apart. It was designed so that no single piece was too heavy for a few strong men to lift, or for a sturdy mule to carry. It was a jigsaw puzzle of destruction. You could take an entire artillery battery, dismantle it into piles of steel, and move it piece by piece over a mountain range. But walking it in was still too slow. The jungle was too dense, the trails too treacherous. If the enemy was 50 miles inland, behind a wall of rainforest, marching a pack howitzer in on muleback might take days or weeks. And in war, time is blood. The commanders needed a way to get that firepower to the front instantly. They needed to bypass the mud entirely. This is where the airborne comes into the story. The concept of the paratrooper was still relatively new and incredibly dangerous. Dropping men behind enemy lines was risky enough. A man is soft, flexible, and can steer a parachute. He can land, roll, and take cover. But a cannon barrel is a rigid chunk of steel. If it hits the ground too hard, it bends. If it lands in a swamp, it sinks. If the breech mechanism slams into a rock, the gun is useless. The challenge was engineering a way to drop a cannon from a C-47 transport plane flying at over 100 miles an hour, have it survive the impact, and then be reassembled by soldiers under fire in less time than it takes to smoke a cigarette. They developed specialized parachute crates. These were padded bundles, ruggedized to take a beating. They figured out exactly how to lash the wheels to a pallet, how to protect the delicate sights, how to wrap the heavy barrel so it wouldn't snap loose. They drilled the crews relentlessly. A 75mm Pack Howitzer crew wasn't just a group of guys who pulled a lanyard. They were pit crews. They were weightlifters. They had to be able to find 9 separate bundles scattered across a drop, zone in tall grass, drag them together, and assemble the gun in minutes. Imagine the chaos of that training. You jump out of a plane, the wind roaring in your ears. You land in a field, untangle yourself from your chute, and then you have to find the pieces of your gun. Where's the breech? Who has the wheels? You're shouting over the noise of the wind, dragging hundreds of pounds of steel through the dirt, clicking locking mechanisms into place, sweating, cursing. And you have to do it fast, because in a real combat drop, the enemy isn't going to wait for you to get ready. The Japanese intelligence had seen paratroopers before. They knew the Americans could drop infantry. But infantry is light. Infantry has rifles and submachine guns. Infantry can be pinned down. The Japanese commanders were confident that if the Americans tried an airborne drop deep in the jungle, the paratroopers would be isolated. They would lack heavy support. They would be surrounded and crushed by the heavier Japanese weapons already positioned in the hills. It was a reasonable assumption. In the history of warfare up to that point, airborne troops were a raiding force, a light cavalry of the sky. They were designed to seize a bridge or cause chaos, but they weren't expected to stand toe-to-toe with entrenched enemies backed by bunkers and field fortification. You don't bring a knife to a gunfight, and you don't bring a paratrooper to an artillery duel. So, the trap was set. The Japanese dug in deeper. They camouflaged their positions with master craftsmanship, weaving living vegetation into their bunker roofs until they were invisible from 10 feet away. They stockpiled ammunition. They waited. They watched the skies, expecting perhaps bombers or maybe strafing fighters, but never imagining that the threat would come in the form of crates drifting down on silk canopies. The Americans picked their moment. The target area was chosen a valley, a clearing, a ridgeline that was critical to the enemy's supply chain. The planning was secretive and intense. The pilots of the troop carrier squadrons briefed on the terrain. It wasn't flat farmland like in Europe. It was a jagged landscape of razor-backed ridges and deep ravines. The drop zones were small, surrounded by towering mahogany and teak trees that could snap a parachute and leave a man dangling 100 feet in the air, a helpless target. The weather was another enemy. In the Pacific, the sky can turn from clear blue to a violent thunderstorm in 20 minutes. Clouds pile up on the mountain ranges, creating walls of turbulence that can snap the wings off. A plane, navigating to a precise drop zone over an endless carpet of green, with few landmarks, required nerves of steel and incredible skill. On the morning of the operation, the airfields were a hive of nervous energy, the paratroopers strapped on their gear. They were heavy, loaded down with ammunition, grenades, rations, and water. But the most important cargo was already loaded into the bellies of the planes, or lashed to the underwings. The guns. The 75mm howitzers, disassembled and packed into their coffins, silent and cold, waiting to be unleashed, as the engines of the C-47 seconds sputtered and roared to life, kicking up clouds of coral dust. There was a sense that they were embarking on a magic trick. They were going to make heavy artillery appear out of thin air. They were going to teleport a firebase into the middle of enemy territory. Inside the planes, the soldiers sat on the metal benches, the vibration rattling their teeth. They smoked cigarettes, checked their static lines, and tried not to think about the jungle waiting below. They knew that the moment they jumped, they would be surrounded. They knew that if the guns didn't work, if the pieces were lost in the tall kunai grass, or if the Japanese were waiting right on the drop zone, it would be a massacre. The flight was long and rough. The planes bumped through the thermal updrafts rising from the jungle floor. Below them, the green carpet stretched out endlessly, broken only by the winding silver snake of a river. To the Japanese soldiers watching from their hidden observation posts on the mountain peaks, the formation of planes was just a distant hum, a speck against the clouds. They might have sounded the alarm, manned their anti-aircraft guns, or simply watched, wondering where the bombers were heading. They didn't scramble their reserves. Why would they? There were no roads leading to their position. There was no way for an American column to be approaching. They felt the arrogance of the untouchable. They believed that the jungle was their moat and the mountains their ramparts. But the hum grew louder. The planes descended, dropping from the cruising altitude to jump height. The doors opened. The rush of wind filled the cabins. The jumpmasters shouted their commands, barely audible over the roar of the engines. Stand up, hook up. This was the moment of no return, the point where the plan meets reality. The paratroopers shuffled to the door, their knuckles white as they gripped their static lines. And then the green light, bodies poured out of the planes, tumbling into the slipstream there, chutes blossoming like white flowers against the dark green backdrop. But mixed in with the men were other colored chutes, signaling equipment, and heavy bundles plummeting toward the earth. From the ground, the Japanese observers must have frozen. They saw the paratroopers, yes, that was bad, but manageable. But then they saw the other crates landing with heavy thuds in the tall grass. They saw the Americans sprinting not for cover, but toward these bundles. They saw them cutting the lashings, pulling out steel tubes, dreading wheels, shouting coordinates. The Japanese commanders likely hesitated. What were they doing? Why weren't they digging foxholes? Why were they assembling something? It takes a well-trained crew, only a few minutes to assemble a pack howitzer, if everything goes right. The Americans were moving with the desperate speed of men who know they are vulnerable. The trails were locked together. The axle was inserted, the wheels were slid on, the cradle, the tube, the breech, click, clack, snap. The sounds of assembly were lost in the noise of the battle that was starting to erupt as Japanese patrols opened fire. But the Americans ignored the stray bullets zipping past them. They had a job to do. They were building a cannon in a field where no cannon should ever be. Within minutes, the first gun was up. The crew leveled the sights. The observer, radio in hand, called out the coordinates of the Japanese bunkers on the ridgeline, the bunker that had been invincible, the bunkers that were safe from everything except a direct hit from a bomb. The loader shoved a 75mm high-explosive shell into the breech. The block slammed shut. The gunner verified the aim. For the Japanese soldiers watching through the slits of their pillboxes, the realization must have come too late. They saw the muzzle flash. A split second later, the roar of the discharge echoed off the jungle walls. And then, the impossible happened. An artillery shell slammed into their position, not a mortar, not a grenade. A true artillery shell, delivering a shockwave of death and destruction. The jungle, which was supposed to be their shield, had just been bypassed. The Americans hadn't climbed the mountain. They had simply stepped over it. The sanctuary of the remote interior was gone. The sky had delivered the one thing the Japanese feared most: heavy, sustained, accurate firepower. And this was only the beginning. As more chutes opened above, and more guns were assembled in the tall grass, the balance of power in the jungle shifted forever. The green hell had just become a lot hotter. The echo of that first shot didn't just fade into the trees, it shattered a mindset that had existed for centuries. Up on the ridges, deep in the tunnel complexes, the Japanese officers were frozen, staring at their maps. The red grease pencil marks that designated safe zones were suddenly meaningless. They frantically radioed their forward observers, demanding to know where the fire was coming from. Was it a naval bombardment? Impossible. The fleet was too far out. Was it heavy mortars? No, the trajectory was wrong, the impact too heavy. When the reports finally came crackling back over the wire that the Americans were firing 75mm howitzers from the middle of a swampy clearing they had parachuted into only minutes ago, The commanders refused to believe it. It sounded like madness. But down in the tall grass, the madness was organized, rhythmic, and deadly. That first gun wasn't alone. All around the drop zone, the scene was a frenzied ballet of sweat and steel. You have to picture the intensity of this moment. Scores of paratroopers were wrestling with heavy, awkward bundles of metal. These weren't clean training grounds. This was uneven terrain covered in razor-sharp kunai grass that sliced skin like paper. The heat was already stifling, turning the air inside the clearing into a steam bath. And yet, the batteries were forming up. This is where the genius of the M1 Pack Howitzer really shined. It was a weapon born of paradox, heavy enough to destroy, yet light enough to fly. The designers had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. There was no heavy armored shield to protect the crew from enemy fire. They were exposed, relying on speed and aggression for survival. The wheels were skeletal. Lightweight alloys with rubber tires that looked almost like they belonged on a farm cart, yet they could handle the recoil of a high-explosive discharge. As the other guns came online, the pop-pop-pop of enemy small arms fire began to intensify. The Japanese infantry, recovering from their initial shock, were moving in. They knew that paratroopers were vulnerable in the first hour after a drop. They knew that if they could overrun the landing zone before the Americans dug in, they could turn the operation into a slaughter. They moved through the jungle with their characteristic stealth blend into the foliage, setting up light machine guns and knee mortars. But the Americans had a surprise for them. The Pack Howitzer wasn't just a long-range weapon. In the claustrophobic confines of the jungle, it could be used as a direct-fire instrument, essentially a giant shotgun. The gunners lowered the barrels. They weren't looking at aiming stakes or calculating parabolas anymore. They were looking through the open sight, directly at the tree line where the muzzle flashes of Japanese machine guns were flickering. Fire mission. Gun 2. Direct front. Bunker complex. Range 400 yards. The loader slammed a shell home. The breech clicked. The gunner yanked the lanyard. The gun bucked violently, the trails digging into the soft earth. 400 yards away, a Japanese pillbox made of coconut logs and sandbags simply evaporated. Logs the size of telephone poles were tossed into the air like matchsticks. The machine gun fire from that sector ceased instantly. This was the terrifying reality the Japanese infantry faced. They were used to fighting riflemen. They were used to the ping of the M1 Garand. They were not ready to face a weapon that could punch a hole through a tank being fired at them from point-blank range by infantrymen. It was a psychological hammer blow. The jungle, which usually absorbed sound and fury, amplified the terror. The concussion of the howitzers in the thick air was physical. It punched you in the chest. One of the most fascinating aspects of these airborne artillery operations was the sheer audacity of the logistics. Dropping the guns was one thing, keeping them fed was another. A 75mm howitzer eats ammunition at a ferocious rate. A single battery could burn through tons of shells in an hour of sustained firing. So, the sky had to remain a conveyor belt. Behind the initial wave of paratroopers came the resupply drops. This was a dangerous lottery. Crates of high-explosive shells were pushed out of planes, dangling under parachutes. If a chute failed, that crate became a bomb, whistling down to impact with earth-shattering force. Paratroopers on the ground had to constantly watch the sky, dodging not just enemy fire but their own falling supplies. There were stories of recovery teams sprinting into the jungle to find lost bundles. Sometimes, a crucial part of a gunner sight or a breech block would drift off course and land in the canopy, dangling 100 feet up. Soldiers would have to climb these slick, moss-covered giants, hacking away vines suspended high above a firefight, just to retrieve the piece of metal that would allow their squad to fight back. It was a treasure hunt, where the prize was survival. And then there were the Grasshoppers. To make the artillery truly effective, you need eyes. In the dense jungle, you can often only see 20 feet in front of you. You might know the enemy is over the next ridge, but you can't see them. Enter the L4 Piper Cub, affectionately known as the Grasshopper. These were tiny, fabric-skinned civilian planes, painted olive drab. They were slow, unarmed, and seemingly fragile, but to the artillerymen, they were angels. The pilots of these little planes were a special breed of crazy. They would buzz right over the treetops, acting as forward observers. They would spot a Japanese troop concentration or a supply convoy hidden on a jungle track radio, the coordinates back to the paratroopers, and then circle around to watch the fireworks. The Japanese hated them. They would fire everything they had at these buzzing gnats. But the cubs were so slow and maneuverable, they were surprisingly hard to hit. They could turn on a dime, dip into a valley, and vanish. With the Grasshoppers calling the shots, the airborne artillery became a surgeon's scalpel. They could drop a shell into a ravine or walk a barrage up a hillside just ahead of advancing American infantry. The Japanese soldiers, huddled in their foxholes, realized with horror that there was no hiding place. The Americans had combined the view from the sky with the power of the heavy gun. But let's not forget the human cost of operating these weapons in this environment. The heat was a physical enemy. Inside the drop zone, the temperature could soar to 100 degrees with 90% humidity. The gun crews stripped to the waist, their skin slick with sweat and grime. Every time the gun fired, it kicked up a cloud of dust and cordy smoke that stung the eyes and burned the throat. The noise was deafening, a constant rhythmic hammering that left men bleeding from the ears. And the mud, the incessant, omnipresent mud, the recoil of the guns would drive the trails deep into the sludge. After a few shots, the crew would have to strain and heave to wrestle the gun back into position, relaying the sights. It was back-breaking labor performed under the stress of combat. They were dehydrated, running on adrenaline and fear, hauling 50-pound shells, loading, firing, reloading. There's a specific engagement that highlights the surreal nature of this warfare. In one instance, a Japanese officer, adhering to the Bushido code, decided that the only way to silence these guns was a frontal charge. He gathered his men soldiers who had spent months surviving on rice balls and sheer willpower and ordered a Banzai attack. They burst from the tree line, bayonets fixed, screaming their war cries, expecting to overrun the American position through sheer spiritual force. It was a clash of eras, the feudal spirit of the samurai against the industrial efficiency of modern America. The paratroopers on the guns didn't flinch. They didn't have time to be afraid. They cut the fuses on their shells to zero delay or set them for muzzle burst. This meant the shell would explode almost immediately after leaving the barrel or upon the slightest impact. The result was a wall of shrapnel. The pack howitzers transformed the clearing into a kill zone. The Japanese charge disintegrated. It wasn't a battle, it was physics asserting its dominance. The bravery of the Japanese soldiers was undeniable, but bravery cannot stop a high-explosive shell moving at the speed of sound. The survivors retreated back into the shadows, leaving the field silent except for the groans of the wounded and the hissing of hot gun barrels cooling in the humid air. This was the turning point in the minds of the enemy. They began to realize that the Americans weren't just fighting the war, they were engineering it. The Japanese army was built on the concept of fighting harder, enduring more, and sacrificing everything. The American army was built on the concept of bringing the factory to the battlefield. By dropping artillery from the sky, the US had bypassed the need for roads, bridges, and supply lines. They had made the terrain irrelevant. Another interesting fact often overlooked is the sheer versatility of the ammunition these sky-dropped batteries carried. It wasn't just high explosive, they dropped white phosphorus, Willie Pete. When these shells burst, they created billowing clouds of white smoke that could screen troop movements, blinding the enemy observers. But white phosphorus also burns with a terrifying, unquenchable heat. When fired into dry kunai grass or the thatched roofs of a supply depot, it created instant infernos. The Japanese troops, terrified of the burning chemical that stuck to skin and clothing, would be flushed out of their hiding spots, right into the sights of the waiting American riflemen. The paratroopers used the artillery not just to kill, but to manipulate the battlefield, herding the enemy like cattle. And what about the guns themselves? The M1 Pack Howitzer had a quirk. It had a short barrel, which meant it had a very distinct, sharp crack when fired, different from the boom of longer guns. To the veterans of the Pacific, that sound became the music of salvation. If you were an infantryman pinned down in a rice paddy, mud in your mouth, bullets snapping over your head, and you heard that sharp crack-whomp of a 75mm shell landing ahead of you, you knew the sky artillery was on the job. But the most incredible thing was the mobility. Once the initial battle for the drop zone was won, the work wasn't over. The paratroopers had to move out, and the guns had to go with them. This is where the pack-in-pack howitzer became literal. March order. The sergeant would yell. In an instant, the firing stopped. The crews swarmed their weapons. In reverse of the assembly, they stripped the guns down. One man took the muzzle, another took the breech. Two men took the wheels. They didn't have mules now, they were the mules. They slung the steel components onto carrying frames, or simply hoisted them onto their shoulders. Imagine hiking up a 40-degree incline, through mud that grabs your ankles, carrying an 80-pound chunk of solid steel. The straps dug into their shoulders. The metal chafed their skin raw, but they moved. They marched deep into the impassable terrain, carrying their own artillery support with them. The Japanese would retreat to the next ridge, thinking they had put distance between themselves and the heavy weapons. They would set up a new defense line, confident that it would take the Americans days to drag guns up the goat trails. They would settle in, eat their rice, and wait. And then, 2 hours later, crack. A shell would land in their midst. The psychological toll this took cannot be overstated. It created a sense of paranoia. If the Americans could bring cannons here, where could they not bring them? Was any place safe? The jungle, once their protector, now felt like a trap. Every clearing was a potential drop zone. Every silence could be broken by the screech of an incoming shell from a gun that had literally fallen from the clouds. As the campaign wore on, the airborne artillery tactics were refined. They learned to drop the guns fully assembled on heavy pallets if the ground allowed it, shaving precious minutes off the firing time. They developed better recoil systems. They learned to coordinate with naval gunfire and bombers, creating a layered symphony of destruction. But the core of the story remained the same. A small group of men dropped into the middle of nowhere, defying the laws of logistics and the expectations of their enemy. They were rewriting the textbook on jungle warfare, one shell at a time. And as the sun set over the smoking ridges, casting long shadows across the battered drop zones, the Japanese commanders were left with a sinking realization. The isolation of the jungle was gone. The sky was open. And from that open sky, the Americans were raining down a storm that no bunker could withstand. The stage was set for the final push. The initial shock had worn off, and the Japanese were adapting, becoming more desperate and more dangerous. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a test of endurance. Could the airborne batteries keep up the pace? Could they survive the inevitable, massive counterattack that was gathering in the darkness? The climax of this jungle duel was approaching, and it would be fought at close quarters. In the mud and the blood, where the only thing that mattered was who could reload faster. The sun didn't just set in the Pacific jungle, it vanished. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple, and the next it was a black void so absolute that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. For the American paratroopers dug in around their artillery pieces. The darkness brought a new kind of terror. The jungle, which had been silent during the heat of the day, woke up. Insects buzzed like electric saws. Unknown creatures shrieked in the canopy. And somewhere out there, amidst the roots and the vines, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving. The Japanese commanders had realized that they could not win a duel of firepower. They couldn't outshoot the Americans, and they couldn't outrange them. Their only hope lay in the darkness. Their plan was simple, brutal, and ancient. Use the night to nullify the technology. If they could crawl close enough within 10 yards, within 5 the artillery would be useless. A cannon cannot shoot a man standing on top of it. They would swarm the batteries with knives, bayonets, and grenades. They would silence the guns by killing the crews with their bare hands. In the American perimeter, the tension was a physical weight. The crews of the Pack Howitzers were exhausted, their bodies pushed beyond the breaking point by the heat and the heavy lifting. But nobody slept. They knew what was coming. They stripped the grease off the ammunition to ensure it wouldn't jam. They laid out their grenades in neat rows. They pointed the muzzles of their 75mm guns not up at the sky, but level with the ground, aiming directly into the walls of black foliage. They were preparing to use the artillery in a way the manuals never intended, as giant shotguns. They loaded canister rounds, shells packed with hundreds of steel balls. When fired, the casing would split open at the muzzle, spraying a cone of lethal metal that would shred everything in its path for hundreds of yards. It was a weapon of last resort, a desperate measure for a desperate hour. The attack didn't begin with a shout. It began with the snapping of twigs, a subtle rustle in the grass that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. The American sentries strained their eyes, staring into the gloom until their vision blurred. Then, a tripwire snapped. A flare shot up, hissing and popping, bathing the clearing in a stark, flickering white light. And there they were. The shadows detached themselves from the trees. A wave of khaki uniforms, helmets netted with leaves, bayonets glinting in the magnesium glare. The Japanese were already inside the wire. The silence shattered into a cacophony of screams, rifle fire, and the distinctive thwack of grenades exploding. Battery fire. The command was screamed over the din. The lanyards were pulled. The jungle night was ripped apart by the muzzle flashes of the Pack Howitzers. The sound was apocalyptic. At point-blank range, the concussion alone was enough to knock a man down. The canister rounds turned the air in front of the guns into a meat grinder. The steel bores ripped through the vegetation, tearing through tree trunks and flesh alike. But the Japanese kept coming. They were driven by a terrifying resolve, stepping over the body of their fallen comrades, charging through the smoke and the fire. They knew this was their only chance to stop the sky monsters that had been tormenting them. They threw themselves at the guns. The battle devolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl. The artillerymen grabbed their carbines and pistols. Some swung entrenching tools and ramrods. The fighting was hand-to-hand, intimately brutal, fought in the flickering strobe light of explosions. A Japanese officer, sword raised, charged a gun crew, only to be cut down by a burst of Thompson submachine gun fire from the battery sergeant. A paratrooper, tackled by 2 enemy soldiers, pulled the pin on a grenade and took them all with him. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. The perimeter shrank. The Americans were backed up against their own guns, firing canister rounds with second fuses. The explosions so close they singed their own eyebrows. The barrels of the howitzers glowed a dull cherry red in the dark, radiating heat waves that distorted the air. The gunners were working like automatons, load, fire, their movements fueled by pure adrenaline. The Japanese wave broke not against a wall of stone, but against a wall of steel rain. The sheer volume of firepower the airborne batteries could generate, even whilst under siege, was too much for flesh and blood to withstand. As the pre-dawn grey began to seep into the sky, the attacks faltered. The screams of Banzai faded, replaced by the groans of the dying and the retreat of the survivors back into the deep jungle. When the sun finally rose, revealing the carnage of the night, the American crews slumped against the wheels of their guns. They were covered in mud, soot, and blood. They looked like statues carved from the earth itself. The clearing in front of the battery was destroyed. The trees were splintered, the grass was gone, churned into a bloody mire. But the guns were still there. The barrels were cooling, ticking as the metal contracted, but they were still pointing at the enemy. This was the breaking point. The Japanese High Command, receiving the reports from the shattered remnant of their assault force, finally understood the magnitude of their defeat. They had thrown their best soldiers, their masters of night fighting and infiltration, against an isolated American force, and they had been broken. They realized then that there was no safe distance. There was no terrain rugged enough to stop the American war machine. If they could drop a fortress into a jungle clearing and hold it against a human wave, the war was already lost. The psychological impact rippled across the entire theater. Japanese soldiers, once confident in their spiritual superiority and their connection to the land, began to look at the sky with dread. Every time a C-47 droned overhead, they wondered if it was bringing more of those terrible guns. The myth of the impassable jungle had been exposed as a lie. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon more potent than any sword. In the weeks that followed, the airborne artillery continued to push inland. They leapfrogged from ridge to ridge. They would dismantle the guns, hike 10 miles through the sucking mud, reassemble them on a peak, and blast the next Japanese defensive line. They became experts at this strange, nomadic warfare. They were a hybrid force, half mule team, half high-tech artillery unit. They innovated constantly. They learned to use the guns to snipe enemy snipers. They learned how to drift shells into the mouths of caves. They learned that a 75mm shell could clear a landing zone for a medical evacuation helicopter in seconds by blowing down the trees. They were the sledgehammer that allowed the infantry to crack the nut of the Japanese defenses. But as the war moved on, as the island-hopping campaign gathered speed toward the Philippines and eventually Okinawa, the role of these specific units began to fade into history. Bigger guns were brought in as ports were captured. Tanks arrived. The sheer scale of the conflict grew, eclipsing the small, desperate battles fought in the green twilight of the early campaigns. Yet, the legacy of those drops remained. They had proven a concept that would define the future of warfare: vertical envelopment. The idea that you could bypass the front line entirely and strike at the enemy's heart with heavy weapons. They were the forefathers of the airmobile tactics used in Vietnam, where helicopters would sling-load howitzers onto hilltops. They were the pioneers of rapid deployment. For the men who were there, the memory of those days never faded. Decades later, old men would wake up sweating, dreaming of the green light in the door of the plane, the rush of the wind, and the desperate race to find the breech block in the tall grass. They remembered the weight of the steel on their shoulders as they hiked up mountains that weren't on any map. They remembered the sound of the jungle at night and the smell of wet earth and cordite. And what of the Japanese? For those who survived, the memory was one of bewilderment. They had prepared for a war of warriors, a war of spirit and endurance. Instead, they faced a war of industry and engineering. They faced an enemy who refused to play by the rules of geography. They looked at the mountains and saw walls. The Americans looked at the mountains and saw drop zones. There is a spot in the deep jungle of New Guinea, reclaimed now by the vines and the moss, where you might still find a rusted piece of metal, maybe a wheel rim, or a fragment of a shell casing. The jungle works fast to erase the scars of man. The trees have grown back, covering the craters. The birds sing in the canopy where shrapnel once flew, but if you stand there in the heavy silence, you can almost feel the echo of what happened. You can feel the vibration of the ground as the grasshoppers buzzed overhead. You can hear the ghostly crack-whump of the Pack Howitzer. It is a testament to a moment in time when the impossible became routine. The story of the air-dropped artillery isn't just a story about a gun. It's a story about the shock of the new. It's about the moment when an ancient, secluded world was violently dragged into the modern age. The Japanese soldier never imagined it could happen. They died believing their mountains would protect them. They were wrong. The sky fell on them, bringing with it the full, crushing weight of American resolve. In the end, the victory wasn't just won by the rifleman or the pilot. It was won by the visionaries who looked at a cannon and asked, "How do we make it fly?" And it was won by the muddy, exhausted, terrifyingly brave men who caught it, built it, and fired it, turning the green hell into a grave for an empire. The jungle eventually grew back, but the world had changed. The barrier of the wild was broken, and warfare would never be the same again.